Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Faith Community Church Sunday School. Pastor Mark, would you lead us in prayer?
Heavenly Father, thank you for a beautiful day today. Thank you for being in the Lord's house. Pray that your God show us more and more of Jesus Christ in your holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Okay, my lesson today is titled Jesus' Final Journey. This came out of our weekly Monday Bible study. And we've been doing character studies. And basically what that means is that we've been picking individuals in the Bible and we've been researching them using either the Bible or other commentaries. And then we've been discussing together what it is that we learned. And how this actually came about was quite accidental. Those of you who attend Bible study, have no fear. This is going to go in a little different direction than what we did, so please don't tune out. You'll see the difference because I learned some things when I was doing this. But so what happened is when we start ending a session and we're starting a new topic, we'll discuss as a group, okay, which area do we want to go? What do we want to study next? Well, it was funny because we opened that up and then Melissa said Barabbas. And we're all looking at each other and we're like, Barabbas, that ought to take all of 5 minutes. Are you kidding? And so we sort of joked around. We said, well, we better come up with somebody else because that's not going to take too long. There's not much out there on Barabbas, so we thought. And so because Pastor Mark just did a recent sermon about Zacchaeus, we said, well, let's do Zacchaeus. Let's see what we can find out about Zacchaeus. Well, in this process, it just took on somewhat of a life of its own, and that's sort of where I want to go with this lesson. Just as an aside, there's a map on the back of your handout that will be a little bit important as we're going to be walking through this journey together. So you can refer to that. The one thing that Zacchaeus and Barabbas have in common is that they were part of this last journey of Jesus. Okay? And so what happened was we started adding in other people and other events. And when you're able to look at the totality of this last journey, it speaks volumes about who Jesus is and who we are. And so I'm hoping that as we're going through some of the detail of what happens in this journey, that we won't lose sight of this aspect of who Jesus is and as it relates to who we are. Okay, so with that, I'll refer you right now to the map. The one thing that I would also mention is that it gets a little difficult trying to really pin down what happens on this final journey. Because if you look at the four Gospels, they don't really mesh up easily. They mesh up, but not easily. Let me explain. Both Matthew and Mark omit 6 months of Jesus' life, the end of his life. They all get back together once they're in Jerusalem, the triumphant entry and what happens there. But before that, this journey and where it starts, Matthew and Mark don't include it. So most of our information is going to come from Luke and John. Now, the interesting thing about Luke and John that I learned in this is that Luke really focuses on the aspects of Jesus' travels outside of Jerusalem and its environs, where John really focuses on what happens in Jerusalem during this time period, okay? So again, that's why it gets a little bit difficult in piecing this together. Now, the journey starts out, and there's agreement in that in both Matthew and in Luke, where they are starting to set out. So on the map, and it's very interesting, I actually heard, oh my goodness, I can't remember, the priest who led the local Catholic Church before Father Maul, he actually did a talk on the Sea of Galilee. And his talk that he did was really on how similar, not necessarily in shape, but in characteristic, that the Sea of Galilee was with Geneva. And I had forgotten. I always think in my mind that Capernaum is at the southern end of the lake. It's not. It's at the northern tip. And so very much like we are at the northern tip of Seneca Lake, that's what Capernaum is. And so we have some similarity between the two. So think about this, let's make Geneva Jesus' headquarters like Capernaum was. How about that? So they launched out and they headed out on the west side of the lake. And then the road takes them down through Galilee. And the normal path that people would take would be to go down through Samaria and either go straight down through, skirting the mountains where that dot says Samaria is, or Sebast, and going a little bit west of there and coming in to Jerusalem that way. Or sometimes what they would do is go all the way over towards Caesarea, and then come in and go that way, avoiding going along near the Jordan River. Okay? Now, Jesus, very purposely, when he got to this city, Geneva, in Samaria, made a choice to go directly to the east and then ultimately head through Jericho. I believe he did it on purpose. I believe he was going out of his way to have some very specific encounters that we're going to talk about. Okay? Now, what the Bible indicates is that he decided to not continue because they weren't receiving him in Samaria. And just on a side note, okay, because I really wanted to include the woman at the well. Melissa talked about her several weeks ago. I really wanted to include her in this, but really, as I did the research, she's not part of this final journey. If you look, I think she's in John chapter 4, and it's either 4 or 6, but the Bible says they were going from Jerusalem into Samaria. So that means it was a return trip. So technically, the woman at the well was not part of this final journey. However, it is significant to note that she was known to be this evangelist. When she left her water pot behind, she went and told people about Jesus. And it says in that chapter in John that people were responding. So here we are sometime later where there's enough people not receiving him where he decides he's not going to go any further. So he moves over to the east and then eventually crosses over the Jordan and continues to head south. Now what's interesting is, as he's making that journey toward the east, this is the wilderness area where he had the 40 days where he was tempted by Satan. Now, think about that. What did Pastor Mark teach about just last week? That the past several weeks, it's sometimes important to go back to a place of significance. And here, Jesus, on his final journey, is purposely going past that wilderness area on his final journey, he's revisiting one of his victories as he's going south. So now, what I'd like to do is pick up as we are going into Jericho. Now, the one thing that I'd like to just make sure that we understand, as I mentioned before, where this all converges back again, where all of the Gospels come back together, is they very briefly mentioned this crossing the Jordan and going outside Judea. Like I said, Matthew and Mark don't go into any detail beyond that. But then they all pick back up again in Bethany. So it's only captured, I believe, in Luke, what happens in Jericho. All right? So let's go to Jericho now. And as we enter Jericho, the one thing I want to mention, so I've got on your handout some suggested Bible verses, and some of those include what happened with Rahab and the walls coming down. And that's just for context. But just in terms of some interesting fact, Jericho is known as the city of palm trees, or the city of palms. Okay? It's located in northeast Jerusalem, just above the Dead Sea, that you can see on the map there. Now, here's something you might not know. It is 800 feet below sea level. It is the lowest city in the world. Now, you could say that once you're in Jericho, it's only up from there, but interesting little factoid. So that means, again, when Jesus is and the disciples are leaving Jericho, they have a significant hill to climb to get to Jerusalem. So that's just a point. Now, the other thing that Jericho is known for, like I said, it's the city of palms. The specific palm tree that it's known for is something called the Judean date palm. All right? Now, the date palm was significant in that it was a symbol of Judah, okay? And it is known as a symbol of grace and elegance and triumph and victory. Judah, whose name means praised, had two twins by his daughter-in-law, whose name was Tamar. Tamar means palm tree. Just throwing that little factoid out there. And the palm, in Psalms, a righteous man is to flourish like a palm tree. Honey, there's a honey palm, is listed as one of the species of a palm tree, and that was a staple in the Judean diet. Roman coinage had a palm tree as a symbol for Israel on it. And though the Judean palm tree had been eradicated for centuries, one of the 2,000-year-old seeds was found in Masada and was germinated. And that tree is called Methuselah. And that tree is now, they have one of these trees growing in Israel right now. So, that's just a little history journey. So there's two encounters that happen here. Now, first we're going to talk about Zacchaeus. All right? Then we're going to talk about Bartimaeus. Now, Zacchaeus, his name means pure, clean, or just. And that certainly did not fit what he was doing for his living. Now, I want to explain a little bit. Tax collectors were despised at that period of time. Let me tell you a little bit about how they did their business, okay? So a tax collector only made a living by taking more than what was required in taxes. So if you had a tax bill of $50, the tax collector would come to you and take $75 or $100. Then what he would have to do is he would keep a cut, because that's how he made his living. They didn't pay him to be a tax collector. And then, because they worked for the chief tax collector, Zacchaeus, he would get his cut from all the tax collectors that were doing their work. So they had to collect enough tax to keep for themselves and then also to pay him. So it was quite a racket that was going on. So that's how he made his money. So Zacchaeus made his money by having a network of tax collectors that were collecting taxes. So it's interesting that when he has this encounter with Jesus, his life is totally changed. Jesus tells him, hey, today I'm going to make my abode in your house. And that's the same for all of us. When we have an encounter with Jesus, he makes his abode with us, and we have a transformed life. So Zacchaeus goes from somebody who's basically a thief and a liar and a cheat, and his life is miraculously turned around by this encounter with Jesus. Now, it's indicated that Jesus spent several days with him. Then he's going to leave town. And as they were leaving town, he has an encounter with Bartimaeus. All right, so let's go into Bartimaeus. What does Bartimaeus' name mean? Now, something to remember. When you see the word bar in a Jewish name, bar means son of. So when you see bar, it's son of, and then whatever's beside it. So in this case, son of Timaeus. All right, now, in Hebrew, it's interesting how this changes. In Hebrew, Timaeus means unclean. But in Greek, Timaeus means honor. So he was either the son of unclean or son of honor. And we see this encounter with Jesus takes him from being the son of unclean in Hebrew and takes him to be son of honor. It's indicated in the Word of God that sin was the reason for his blindness, but it's not given whether it's his sin or some generational sin, because Jesus says, sin no more to him. But, so Jesus has this cleansing power and effect. And what's also interesting is that the importance of the cloak. Bartimaeus had a cloak. Being blind as a beggar, somebody had to take him to where he was every day and then pick him up at the end of the day. Now, to go back a little bit, his family, it indicates that perhaps his family was prominent in some way. So how he came from being part of a prominent family to needing to be a beggar, we're not told what happened there. But we are told that, think about it. He's got this cloak, so he's going to be left out in the elements, unprotected, so he needs this cloak to keep him dry if it's raining, and the few times it would rain, keep him warm if it gets cold. And then they also used it, he'd have it in front of him, and when people went to throw him coins, they would throw it in the cloak. The cloak would catch the coins. That's the significance of the cloak. When he has the encounter with Jesus and he becomes healed of his blindness, remember he's blind, he leaves the cloak behind. He doesn't need the protection anymore because Jesus is his protector. He doesn't need to be collecting the money anymore because Jesus is going to provide for him. So that's the significance of Bartimaeus. In order to get from Jericho to Jerusalem, you have to take the Jericho Road. Now, this is the famous Jericho Road that Jesus talks about in the parable of the Good Samaritan. And I listed the verse there that indicates the Jericho Road in that parable of the Good Samaritan. Of interest, there is a building, an inn, that remains on that road called the Inn of the Good Samaritan. And it's been rebuilt over the years, but it's supposed to sit on the original site of the inn that was referenced in Jesus' parable. So, again, make no mistake, that is a real road. And the pictures of it, it's not a road like we think of a road. It is literally a sidewalk. Only two people can pass together on it. So it's very narrow. It's more a sidewalk than it is a road. Now, on the Jericho Road, from Jericho, as you're going toward Jerusalem, it rises 3,200 feet as part of that walk, that journey. So you're going uphill if you're going from Jericho to Jerusalem. It's uphill all the way. A robust traveler, and it's 15 miles long, can do that journey in about 8 hours. Yeah, a little factoid there. So again, most of this information is in Luke. John doesn't really cover that. But now we're getting into the outskirts of Jerusalem. We're entering now into Bethany. And that's where John picks up. And so as we enter Bethany, Mary and Martha live there with Lazarus. So this is the next significant encounter. Lazarus is raised from the dead. Now, just some highlights here on that. Verse 14 says he was dead. So this isn't a fable. He was really dead. He was dead 4 days. All right? And in verse 43, Jesus raises him to life. Okay? So it's a significant miracle. He's literally dead, and now he's alive. It's undeniable, this miracle. The interesting thing, and I think a lesson for us here, everything in this encounter has something to do with us, by the way. So let me take a pause here and say, so far, we've had an encounter with somebody who was a liar, a thief, a cheat, a robber, and somebody who was blind. Now we have this encounter with somebody who was dead. When he comes back to life again, it's interesting to note the second part of verse 44, or the first part of 44, demonstrates he was bound. He comes out and he's bound. And the Word of God indicates that his hands, his feet, and his head were bound. Something that we can keep in mind. Okay? Then Jesus gives the command, loose him. So just because we have an encounter and we're brought through salvation to newness of life, we have to work at our liberty. We have to make sure that our head is unbound, that our hands are unbound, that our feet are unbound, so that we can be Jesus here on earth. It says in John 12, 9 and 10, that Lazarus became a very well-known evangelist for Jesus. He was the living embodiment. I was dead and now I'm alive. And in fact, they were seeking to kill him because of how effective his witness was. Do a time check here. All right, I'm all right. There's something else that I learned that I did not realize. There's something called the 10th day of Abib. All right? And with that, and there's an alignment here. There's symbolism here that I want to really draw out. So now Jesus is in sort of the suburbs and close by to Jerusalem. And the date that he arrives there is significant, okay? Because it's the 10th day of Abib. The Passover lamb that was going to be sacrificed was kept in safekeeping from the 10th day until the 14th day when it was sacrificed. So Jesus stayed in Bethany and Jerusalem in safekeeping from the 10th day to the 14th day when he had the encounter in the Garden of Gethsemane. And that's where I want to take us next. We are now in the Garden of Gethsemane. Judas has betrayed Jesus, and there's Roman soldiers, there's soldiers from the high priest and representatives of the high priest, and they come to arrest Jesus. And the last, not the last, the last healing of Jesus was the healing of Malchus. And there's some really interesting details that we can learn from Malchus. All of the Gospels point to a person that's a slave. The Greek word is doulos. Only one Gospel gives the name, and that's John. John refers to him by his name Malchus. Malchus was a common name in Arabia and Syria. So he was a slave of either Arabian or Syrian descent. He was most likely there to be an observer or a reporter to go back and tell Caiaphas how it went. The second part of this is the swordsman. None of the Gospels say who had the sword except John. John is the only one that identifies Peter as the swordsman. Now, something that I learned in looking at this that I think is of critical importance. I think sometimes we bestow on Peter some act of bravery, how wonderful it was that he had this sword and man, he was going to take them on. But really, it's the exact opposite. Peter was warned by Jesus that Satan was after him, and Jesus was praying for him. Yet, for whatever reason, Peter didn't hear. And isn't it an interesting contrast? Peter didn't hear. Malchus's ear was cut off and healed. Now, at any point, if Peter heeded or heard, maybe he wouldn't have denied Jesus 3 times. But here he is, totally in his own will. I'm going to take on everybody. And Jesus rebukes him and says, "Put back your sword." He had to go to the cross. The cross had to happen. The scriptures had to be fulfilled. Peter was in his own will. He was not in the will of God. Jesus was in the will of God, following the path to the cross. So there's this interesting contrast between Malchus and Peter, where Peter takes his ear off, but Peter's the one who's deaf. And in this chaos, soldiers had fallen down at the sight of Jesus, at the words of Jesus. They're scrambling to get back up again. The disciples are running around, and Jesus is laser focused on a slave who's not even of his people, the Jewish people. And he focuses his attention and his energy and restores the ear, symbolic of the hearing. Lastly, I want to talk about Barabbas. We go from the Garden of Gethsemane, now we're in the Praetorium. And Jesus is on trial before Pilate. And in a spineless move, he decides, hey, it's the Passover. I can release someone. I'll try to release Jesus. Now, there's a lot of things that are hidden in this that are very important for discovery. We just talked about Bar being son. So let's look at the word Barabbas, the name Barabbas. Son of Abba. Abba being father. Barabbas' name meant son of the father or son of the teacher. If you further look into history, it actually states his first name was Jesus. Jesus Barabbas. Jesus, son of the Father. So we have Jesus, son of the Father, and Jesus, son of the Father. And the wrong one gets released. What's even more important about this? The Gospels give indication of the kind of person Barabbas was. He was charged with rebellion. Jesus was charged with rebellion. Barabbas was indicated to be a notorious prisoner in Matthew. Mark echoed the same thing. Luke says he was in prison with rebels. How about 2 other rebels who had committed murder during insurrection? It was a practice of the Romans to have the prisoners make their own cross. So I want you to consider that there were 3 people that were supposed to be crucified that day. One of them was Barabbas, who had made his own cross. He gets released, and Jesus is crucified on Barabbas' cross. The cross meant for Barabbas. Jesus was sacrificed on that cross. So, in conclusion, we put ourselves in all of these positions. Are we spiritually blind and need to have our sight restored like Bartimaeus? Are we spiritually dead and need to have our lives restored to us like Lazarus? Are we deaf and need our hearing restored like Malchus? And we know that we all are Barabbas because the cross that Jesus was crucified on, he took our place. We created that cross. and it was his sacrifice. He took our place on the cross. So this final journey, let us never forget, he went out of his way for Bartimaeus, for Zacchaeus, for Lazarus, for Malchus, for Barabbas, and for us. That's all I have. Any questions? Comments? Yes.